Also, incidentally, and this is not that important, but it just struck me when I was reading it, how far people had to travel in cars at those times, when it was like, we can just hop on the tube and get there now. And it's like, gosh, it's so far away, actually. But anyway, look, sorry, I digress.
I have to say, I did once see Josh Harkness in my street, Hallie, so, you know, I do live in a pretty famous area.
As a historian, now I'm going to get all nerdy and excited as a historian.
You're in the right place.
Welcome to After Dark.
I know. One of the reasons why I just think murder stories or crime stories are so fantastic for historians is that just the amount of documentation that a crime produces is like gold for us.
But there's something so haunting about this idea that your friends leave, all seems well, and the next thing we know of Belle is that she is occupying a space in a cellar in the house.
The Atlantic Ocean churned beneath the SS Montrose as it made its way to Canada. Captain Kendall was, so far, pleased with progress, though there was something that was unsettling him. On board, there was a father and son that had caught his eye, and although Kendall couldn't quite put his finger on it, there was something strange about them, about the way the boy's ill-fitting clothes hung to his body, about the affection between the pair. In fact, they were not father and son at all, but man and woman fleeing from Britain. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen had shaved off his distinctive moustache, while his partner, Ethel Neve, had set aside her usual skirts and ornaments in favour of a boy's garb. Why the disguise? The pair were heading for what they thought was a new life. Their gruesome misdeeds left behind in London, the authorities outwitted. As the nautical miles sped by, Crippen and Neve began to relax. They'd gotten away with murder, the killing of Belle Elmore, to be precise. But little did they know, and despite the waves that separated them, the police were already in hot pursuit. As the Canadian coastline lunged into view on the horizon, it promised a freedom close enough to touch. Captain Kendall, though, had other plans. Emerging now through the ocean fog was a faster vessel, the SS Laurentic. On board was Chief Inspector Walter Dew, who'd been tipped off by Kendall, something only made possible through a new technology, the telegraph. Chief Inspector Dew boarded the Montrose, his eagle eyes scanning the deck until he spotted Crippen. He had his man. As the sea calmed and land grew nearer, Dr. Crippen's world began to collapse. Seeing their game was up, he and Neve surrendered, and part of them was relieved too. The suspense, Crippen told the inspector, had been too great. I couldn't stand it, he said, any longer.
Hello and welcome to an After Dark that we think you're going to particularly enjoy. My name's Anthony.
And I'm Maddy.
And what you just heard there was the moment that Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was arrested for the murder of Belle Elmore. Now, this is the story that caused, I suppose, a sensation across the globe in its time. And it is the subject of today's guest's brand new book, Story of a Murder. Now, if you've ever done any research, you'll know that when you're stuck in books yourself, you find it very difficult to read for pleasure. But when this book came across my desk, it inveigled its way into every moment of my day. I was reading when I should have been researching, so if I'm late with deadlines, we can blame this book. And the guest that's responsible for my potentially late deadline is the utterly brilliant historian and author Hallie Rubehold, whose work, as you may well know, challenges long-held narratives and gives voice to those who history has overlooked. Her groundbreaking books, like The Five, don't just tell histories, they change how we think about those histories. If you're not reading her work, you're missing out on some of the most important historical writing and resulting conversations today. Hallie, welcome to After Dark.
Thank you, that's quite an introduction.
Well, listen, we're fans on After Dark. It'll come as no surprise. So this is a really special one for us. So we're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
I have to say, as we are recording this, my laptop is sat on a pile of books, and making up this pile is the new Story of a Murder that we're here to talk about, and the hardback copy of the Five. So you are literally holding up the work that I'm doing right now, Hallie.
That's very flattering.
Let's begin with the world that this story is set in, because the thing that I admire so much about the work that you do is not only that you take us into history that we feel we know something of and you give us a new perspective on it, but also that you give us a panoramic view. You really build the world in which it is set. And this time we're in the Edwardian era in the UK and also in the US. We're moving between both sides of the Atlantic. So can we just start with a sense of what this world looks like, feels like, what's going on in this moment?
I think it's such an exciting and interesting time period. It's a time of extreme change in everybody's lives. I think, in terms of technology, but what that technology does to people in the way they perceive their world. So, you have to think that really the book kind of covers the 1880s roughly, but more the 1890s, 1900. The murder takes place in 1910. And in that period, especially the 1890s and, turn of the century, and certainly the decade before the First World War, there was so much intense and fast change happening. If you think about it, the automobile, the airplane, motion picture, X-rays, Marconi wireless, so wireless technology, which is what we were talking about. All of these things that we tend to associate with the birth of modernity, and also at the press as well, the media becoming much more modern in our sense, in that, the updates that were possible through wireless technology and also through the telephone as well. People could phone their stories in if they wanted to, and news traveled incredibly quickly, which is one of the fascinating features of this story, is that, the scene that you were describing with Crippen and Ethel on the Montrose and the Laurentic chasing after them with Inspector Dew on it, the whole world was following that story. Crippen and Ethel didn't know that they had been found. They had been discovered by Captain Kendall, and he had used the Marconi wireless to wire back to shore to tell everybody this, and Scotland Yard knew about it, but also so did the press. And so they were actually tracking the positions of the ships, both ships, as they were pulling into Quebec. And newspapers were published twice a day, so you could get twice daily updates about what was going on. And you could imagine how riveting that was. That was like real time. It was almost like a reality drama. It was like this sort of O.J. Simpson chase of the 1910s. And this is why the story was called, well, it was named the crime of the century at the time, because, it's this intersection of technology, super fast ships, wireless technology, and also psychology, this idea that people were coming alive to, this is the time of Freud and trying to understand the criminal mind. And so there was a lot of discussion about that, and who was this person, Crippen, and who was this woman in his thrall. And so all of these things were sort of intersecting at this moment, and the people writing about it became very excited about, what does this say about the 20th century? What's going to happen?
I think that's a really good insight, Hallie, into what people are reacting to within this story on the ground at the time. And I love that idea of news at this moment in time traveling around the world as fast as it possibly can. And there's this chase happening at the same time. It's so dramatic, and you can see why it appealed to people. And before we get into talking a little bit about some of those people and the events that unfolded, I just want to hone in on its draw to you, because you finish a book like The Five and it's incredibly well received. It makes a huge impact in the field, and I would imagine that there's a moment where you sit and you go, good Lord, what am I doing next? I know I would, and I'm just
Yeah, you've read my mind. I mean, that is exactly what I said for years as I was doing this, and the terrible kind of almost crippling fear of the shadow of the five being cast over this book, and how on earth could I top or even match the impact of that book? And and at some point I just had to reconcile myself to not doing that. That this would be a different book, and it was what it was, and it will be accepted for what it is, or people won't like it or they will like it. It's just it's just the way books are. But it's terrifying. It's like I can imagine being like a gold winning athlete, gold medal athlete at the Olympics, and having won gold or triple gold or something like that. What do? When you come back in 4 years' time? And that in itself, the psychology of that is difficult as a writer.
It's interesting, isn't it, though, that even in the Edwardian period, this case in particular, like you said, it was called the crime of the century. And it's kind of reflective of I suppose the optimism, the self-interest of that moment, that, only a little bit of the 20th century had elapsed at that point, and this is already the crime of the century. And you think about the Ripper case that the Five is about, and that it expands and sponges out in lots of ways, was the crime of the 19th century. And so I can see why this would interest you, Hallie, as a sort of, I suppose, a natural progression of that, that this is another massive case to sink your teeth into, and one, as we're about to find out, that has so many different viewpoints, perspectives, ways into it as well. Let's talk about some of the characters then in this. I don't want to start with Crippen, so let's start with Belle Elmore, or Cora Crippen as she's called. And can you explain first of all why she has those two separate names, and tell us a little bit about her?
Well, I call her Belle Elmore for the better part of the book, because that's how ultimately she liked to refer to herself, and that was the name she settled on. It's interesting. Both of you will have come across this as historians, and especially 18th century historians. Is I love how people just kind of shrug off names and put on new ones all the time. It's just like, could you imagine if we could just all do that? And it's just the ease with which you can give yourself another name in previous centuries, I think, is fascinating. And it really speaks to an individual's sense of identity and how mutable that could be.
Particularly for women, right?
For women, particularly, yes. So Belle was born in Brooklyn, and her original name was, and this is quite a mouthful, Kunigund Makamotzi. And she was born to her mother was of German descent, and they were immigrants, and her father was Polish-Russian. And so the name Kunigund is German. I'm probably mispronouncing it because I don't speak German. But the problem with that is that it was a really ungainly name, and they realized that, this is not a great name for a young girl born in America, because Americans can't, pronounce it. And they quickly changed her name to Concordia, and she changed it to Cora, which is what she then came to be known as. Or sometimes she called herself Corrine. And so she's constantly playing with her names. She changes her last name as well, which is interesting. So she calls herself... So her biological father, died shortly after she was born, and her mother remarried somebody called Frederick Mersinger. And just before Belle left home to go out to work as a servant, she was told by Frederick that she was his adopted daughter, and he wasn't her biological father. And I think that must have surprised her in some way, because she then adopted the surname of Turner. And so she called herself Cora Turner. And the reason for that is, and I consulted a number of people, is in Brooklyn and all over the United States and in Germany as well, there were these societies called the Turnverein. And the Turnverein were like there were social societies. They had gymnasiums. They had singing groups. They had kind of education. They had schools, and they were kind of German cultural centers. And often immigrants to the United States, German immigrants, changed their surnames to Turner because the Turnverein were called the Turners. So I think that's, it's very interesting. And I think that's where she got that. And then eventually she calls herself Cora Crippen when she marries Crippen. And then when she takes to the stage and becomes a musical performer, she reinvents herself as Belle Elmore. And that is the name she is happiest with and most comfortable with.
So how does she end up on the stage in the musical, Hallie? Because the Victorian music hall, certainly there's a certain image that's coming to mind, the sort of raucousness of it, the bawdy songs, the fun of it, I suppose, and the slight risk and potentially sort of sexiness. Is the Edwardian music hall like that? And what is the route that she takes to get there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, something really interesting had happened from about the 1890s. There was a real impetus to clean up the music hall. So all of these kind of bawdy songs and things like that, the music hall suddenly became a place where you could bring your family, and it became variety performance. And variety performance was, I mean, I remember when I was researching this, I really didn't know very much about the music hall, even though, my grandfather and my nana used to sing the songs. My Cockney grandparents used to sing the songs. And I recently discovered in some of my grandfather's old things, he's long passed away, but he had this big book of music hall history that I thought, oh, he'd be so proud of me doing this now. He'd love it. So there was this desire to make it very family friendly, and it was a variety performance. So the thing about music hall is that it wasn't just people singing and dancing as we would tend to think. There were singers and dancers, but there were magicians and ventriloquists and animal acts and performing elephants and even weird motion picture. I mean, motion picture starts to feature in music hall at about the turn of the century as well. So it's like you can have dancing dogs, and then you'll have a woman on a high wire, and then you'll have somebody singing a kind of sad song, and then you'll have a pantomime, and then you'll have a mime artist, and it was this weird breadth of stuff that and it was kind of like the precursor to television, and that's where people would go. It didn't cost very much. You could all go and have a laugh and leave singing the songs, and so that's what it had become by the time Belle Elmore had embarked upon a career in music hall. Though it's still, women as performers, still had a somewhat questionable reputation according to society, and this idea that they're all rather kind of a lascivious bunch and sleeping with each other and having illegitimate children, and they were bohemians. They had a completely different way of living.
One of the things I think musical does in the book so well, actually, and no spoiler to anybody who maybe does not know this history, but things, as we shall discover, don't necessarily end very well for Belle. But in so many retellings of this particular crime and this particular life, that's the kind of key part of the story. However, what music hall does for Belle, I think, is bring her back to life. You get this great sense of urgency, of vitality, of music, singing, dancing, creativity. And for most of the book, that's where we are living in that world with her. That's where we spend most of our time. And I just think that's a really useful tool in Story of a Murder that gives her as much life as she possibly can, given, that we're over 100 years removed from it. But we have another woman that's at the heart of this case as well, and that's Ethel and Neve. And Ethel is actually such a complex person. It's so easy to maybe think of these people as characters, but this is a person who lived and breathed. And Ethel is very different to Belle in so many ways. Hallie, can you introduce us to Ethel and the complexities therein?
Yes, you really kind of hit the nail on the head with Ethel. I have to say that Ethel has haunted me. I have thought about her like constantly, even since writing this book. She's been a presence because she's so enigmatic in many ways. And, you know, throughout her life, she told her story on a number of occasions. She sold her story to the press. And, like, so many things change in each account that she gives of herself. And as time goes by, she seems to implicate herself more and more in the murder. And it's just, and almost unashamedly, you know, after being acquitted. So Ethel was born in Diss in Norfolk. And her parents were not well off. She was born in basically a 2-room cottage. And in what was, for the most part, rural Norfolk. Her father was kind of, I don't want to say ticket taker. He was a clerk in part of the railway station in Diss, and the interesting thing is, and this says a lot about social history and upward mobility in the late 19th century. For centuries, the Neve family, as they were known, I will explain the le at the you know, the beginning of the name in a moment, but the Neve family were agricultural laborers, and something really interesting had happened about mid 19th century, which was Walter, Ethel's father's father, became a gardener to a kind of, you know, sort of lower gentry family, the Mannings, who were the vicars in Diss. And in becoming a gardener, he suddenly attained more social status, and then he could put Walter, Ethel's father, into school, and at proper school. And at proper school, he learned to read and write to a standard which would allow him to become a clerk. And once you were a clerk, you were no longer part, technically, of the working class. You were sort of very low middle class, so he had jumped in status very subtly, and Walter wanted this for his children, and so he moved the family to London, and they lived in Hampstead. And he wanted to put his daughters, which is quite surprising. I mean, Walter is a very interesting character because he is very conservative. He's very religious. He is, you know, paterfamilias, you know, Victorian paterfamilias, and he's also rather stupid as well, because Ethel is a bit of a rebel, and he's just, the wool has been pulled over his eyes so significantly that it's embarrassing. So his sons get proper schooling, but he also schools his daughters, and they are taught shorthand. They go to Pitman's Secretarial College, which was a type of continuing education for girls after they finished their education in school. And Ethel learned shorthand typing, which was a sort of entryway. Shorthand and typing, I should say, and lots of other things like, you know, bookkeeping and how to answer telephones, and this was a gateway to getting what might be considered a respectable job, working in an office. Because for women, the options were, women of Ethel's class, I mean, you either worked in domestic service, you worked in a factory, or you worked in a shop. But this was something altogether different, and you could meet a man of a different class. You could meet a man, you know, kind of comfortable middle class, who might even marry you. So it had a lot of benefits. And that is how Ethel met Dr. Crippen, because she was hired to work in one of his dodgy places of employment. Crippen was a con artist and a fraudster, and he was involved in medical fraud and patent medicine. And Ethel and her sister were both working for the Drouet Institute, which purported to cure deafness with its plasters, which you stuck behind your ear. And they managed to get themselves into a lot of trouble, just, you know, fraudulently peddling medicines. But Ethel became Crippen's right-hand woman, and knew all of his schemes and helped out in them and became very important to his business. And then they became lovers as well.
You set out there two very different routes that these two very different women take. We've got, on the one hand, a story of an immigrant family and a woman who eventually ends up on the stage in a profession that is questionable in terms of respectability, even by the Edwardian period. And then you have this other woman who has opportunities, okay, certainly not handed to her. She has to work hard and circumstances align, but she has an opportunity to take that road to a more respectable life. And the thing that unites these women is Dr. Crippen himself. And one thing that I'm kind of curious about, Hallie, is when you wrote the five, obviously you sort of, to a certain extent, as much as possible really, removed so-called Jack the Ripper from that story, or at least removed his central starring role, I suppose, and the sort of monstrous presence that he has in those retellings. In this case, we know who the central male figure is of the story, and there's presumably a lot already documented about him. So how did you approach how you were going to tell Crippen's story and get to who he was, knowing that he sort of, I suppose, having that information about him already and that identity already attached to him?
Well, I think it was about kind of repositioning Crippen, because the whole concept behind Story of a Murder is that it is a story of a murder, not a murderer. And most true crime will take either the perpetrator and put them in the center of the story, and it becomes their story, and why did they do this, and we follow them all the way through, or it becomes the story of the police officer, or, the detective, or who catches the criminal. But it's such a one-note telling of a crime story, and the difference with Story of a Murder is that is the acknowledgement that crime is an incredibly, complex and potentially panoramic story, which encompasses so many people and so many things, so many lives, so many subplots and so many stories, and a murder is never simple, and especially a murder like this, which becomes a historic event. And so the more you pull back the lens, the more you see and the more you understand. And so that is my approach. So I have decentered Crippen. Of course he's present in the story, but it is also equally Belle's story. It is also Ethel's story, and it's the story of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, who would later pursue Crippen for the disappearance of his wife, the very strange disappearance. So everybody plays a role in a story of a murder. And so it's an ensemble cast.
And it's not just people who are playing these roles. We also have the house in North London, where becomes a really kind of a key, it becomes a crime scene. But it also, before that, is the domestic setting in which Belle and Crippen are living together as man and wife, and they're entertaining their friends, and you get this real sense of people coming and going. Also, incidentally, and this is not that important, but it just struck me when I was reading it, how far people had to travel in cars at those times, when it was like, we can just hop on the tube and get there now. And it's like, gosh, it's so far away, actually. But anyway, look, sorry, I digress. But we have the house, and we have the home, and Belle and Crippen are there, and they're entertaining, and they're living this seemingly happy, although we know it's not quite so content life. Now, we also then have Ethel coming into that same domestic space at various times in this story, and assuming, especially when, as we will learn, Cora and Belle goes missing, but she assumes some of those roles. She even claims to be the woman of the house at certain times. So I'm just wondering if you can take us into the house, Hallie, and let us know the different dynamics that are unfolding there. And eventually we'll build up to what we think happens there, what does happen there, what we know happens there. But give us an idea of the setting that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, so Hilltop Crescent is, it's funny when you talk about this crime, and people remember a handful of things. They'll remember Marconi Wireless, and they'll remember Ethel dressed as a boy, and they'll remember the Montrose, and then they'll remember Hilltop Crescent as being, this address, 39 Hilltop Crescent. So Hilltop Crescent, so the Crippens moved there in 1905, and before that they were living on Store Street in Bloomsbury in central London. And, this was really by the sort of Edwardian expectations of the time, Crippen was expected to provide a proper house, a proper home for his wife, even though there would not be any children, because he had removed Belle's ovaries when she was about 21 years old because he didn't want children, and he made up some sort of excuse. But, he had to give her effectively what was expected, and so he rented this house, although he pretended he wasn't renting it. He pretended he had bought it, but that's completely in keeping with his personality. And the Crippens were completely obsessed with keeping up appearances, and Hilltop Crescent really fed into that as well. So this was an address. This is an address in Holloway, and if any of you are familiar with a contemporary book that was published kind of maybe about 10 years before the Crippens moved there, called Diary of a Nobody, which is by the Grossmith brothers, which is about Charles Pooter, this clerk who lives in Holloway and has all of these, keeping up with appearances, affectations, and, worries about his sherry glasses and his Christmas cards, and his house backs onto a railway line, and everybody laughed at the social satire. Well, the Crippens were living that. I mean, and that was the absurdity of this is that, they had walked right into Pooterville. And they had it was this 10-room house. It was a massive house for them. And they lived largely in the downstairs, in the kitchen and what was called the breakfast room. Because they, and their English friends were kind of a bit sniffy about this, because they thought, God, they live with this sort of undue informality. They've got this big house. Why are they spending so much time down here? And they only used the upstairs rooms when they had company, and they were very informal. And it's interesting because there was a lot of anti-Americanism at this time, and this is really reflected in the commentary, the kind of sniping, catty commentary about, she's so messy and she doesn't keep a maid, and she did keep a maid. She kept a charwoman who came and went. It just wasn't a live-in servant. And so there was a lot of kind of snippiness about that. But they did, they the two of them actually planted an enormous, kind of beautiful garden in the back. Which included they kept chickens as well, and birds, and they had an aquarium, and they had cats, and they had a dog, and because Belle couldn't have children, and it always just played on her that she couldn't have children. So, but the house was a very comfortable and very nice house, which they had parties in, all the music hall performers. I mean, these people were really famous who were coming over. You can imagine what your neighbors would say if, suddenly you had kind of Brad Pitt come over one night, and all of these other sort of famous people, turning up at your house. And that's how they lived their lives. And so, Ethel really, 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 really craved this life. She wanted this, and she wanted the nice clothes and the diamonds that Belle wore, and the celebrity friends, and all of these things, and that was behind a lot of what would happen next.
I have to say, I did once see Josh Harkness in my street, Hallie. So, I do live in a pretty famous area. I live in the middle of nowhere. It's funny because you paint this picture of, on the one hand, sort of suburban mundanity, really, that this is, as you say, a life of affectation and aspiration, but just not quite attaining the level that the people living it would like to occupy, I suppose. And then on the other hand, you have this sort of creative energy and this community that's buzzing with aspiration, but also with genuine creativity, that's fitting into this house in a slightly strange way. And then we get the same house being transformed into a crime scene. And it's strange to think about that architectural space functioning in all those different ways. And I think that must be very exciting as a writer when you go into a story like this, spending so much time imagining that space, walking those rooms. And
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, first of all, well, as a historian, now I'm going to get all nerdy and excited as a historian.
You're in the right place.
Welcome to After Dark.
I know. So, one of the reasons why I just think murder stories or crime stories are so fantastic for historians is that just the amount of documentation that a crime produces is like gold for us, because it's all first-hand accounts. It's people saying, well, I was living here and I was doing this and I was eating this and I was wearing this and I had this and I saw this person, I said this to this person, and I thought this and I did that. And where do you get that normally as a historian? It's so hard to find those things. And so, like, Maddy, you just absolutely honed in to this. God, we are such kindred spirits. This is like, you guys are just asking all the right questions. So, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this house and imagining it, but also it helped to have these documents and the neighbors, what the neighbors said about the house, and also the inventory, because at one point, you know, everything the Crippens owned was put on the market on auction to pay legal bills. And so you have a total inventory of like everything they owned.
So you can refill those rooms.
Yes, you can refill those rooms. And in fact, I was talking to a curator the other year, I think, about, you know, how do we know about house history, and, you know, what sort of things did people have and how did they live in these rooms at these times? And I said, look at the Old Bailey Sessions papers. Look at reports. Look at, you know, any crime will tell you these things. You will know exactly how people occupied houses or businesses or anything, because it's all there in great detail. So that's really, really exciting for me. Thank you, fellow nerds, for letting me do that.
You take as much time as you need. But you talk about, you know, imaginatively filling these rooms. Let's do that now. Let's fill those rooms the night in question. We have some. This was so intriguing to me as well, where they have the Crippens have visitors over on this key night, and they Dr. Crippen almost bullies these poor people into coming over, that they, you know, they kind of don't want to go, but anyway, they end up being there. Give us a sense of that night.
That night.
Yeah, and then what unfolds thereafter.
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, this is a perfect segue from what we were saying, because there is this incredible document, which was written by Clara Martinetti, who was Belle's best friend, about the last night they spent with the Crippens at their house. And it is an 8-page document where Clara writes down everything that happened that night. And, like, you know, Scotland Yard had said to her, Inspector Dewey had said to her, write down everything you remember about that night. And she did. And everything that she talked about, like, it's just so amazing. I mean, you know, she talks about, like, well, you know, we were trying to decide whether we wanted to go or not. And Paul, her husband, Paul Martinetti, Paul wasn't feeling that well because he was being treated for some condition he had, and she never really revealed what that was. And he came back from his treatment and he felt a bit queer, they said, and they didn't want to go. And Crippen was knocking on the door and saying, oh, come on, please. And you can kind of understand, because the Crippens and the Martinettis used to see each other a couple of times a week. You know, there's a time before television, a time before, you know, obviously you could text your friends. People didn't spend that much time ringing each other on the phone. They did have phones, but they didn't spend tons of time talking. And so, you spent your past your evenings with your friends, and it's so touching, this relationship. And what is so appalling later is just how Crippen exploited this, and the way he treated the Martinettis afterwards is just disgusting. um but so they were invited. The Martinettis went very grudgingly, and then they recount their entire, like, they lived just off Shaftesbury Avenue in mansion flats, and they recount their entire journey, how they got to Hilldrop Crescent in 1910 on the 31st of January. And they walked, and it was one of those, I love that. It's just, like, they said, we know, we walked and walked, and we couldn't get a taxi. And I thought, oh God, anyone who lives in London knows that experience. And so we ended up having to get public transportation, which is what she said. We got the tram, all the way to Hilldrop Crescent. And then she says, and it's just so lovely, because I often think of, when you're going to see your good friends, and there's the Bance is recorded, and she turns up, and Belle opens the door, and she says, "You call this 7 o'clock?" And they all start laughing, and you're like, that's so timeless. That is such a timeless kind of expression of friendship, and the joking, and they take off their coats and their hats, and they sit down, and Clara and Belle are sort of arguing, "Oh, Belle, you shouldn't have made such an effort." And she goes into the kitchen, she brings out meat, and she brings out "Oh no, you really shouldn't. No, let me get up and help you with no." And that whole interplay, and then what cigarettes they smoked afterwards, and then they go upstairs and they play bridge, and then it's getting late, and Paul isn't feeling well, and then Crippen is sent out to get a taxi, and he disappears, and they're waiting, and it's getting later, and then finally they get a taxi and they leave. And that's the last time she sees her friend alive. And it's hugely moving.
It's such a gift as well. I mean, not to bore people too much with the process of writing, but so often when you sit down as a historian to write, and you are responsible for reporting the facts as you can find them out, and of course, we can argue about the distance of time and how much of fact and truth we can actually recover, but when you sit down to write, you start to think, okay, I need to describe this scene, I need to describe, were the birds singing? Was it raining? Was it sunshine? What time of year was it? What time of day was it? Was it dark? Was it light? Could you hear the church bells? And to have someone record all of that, and you don't need to imagine or make clear that you're imagining a conversation, or as you say, a bit of banter, a bit of friendly joking. It's all there, and you just need to bring it to life on the page, and it's the job is half done for you. I mean, that's so satisfying and so rare to find.
So satisfying. And it's so, but this is the thing, is that this stuff, I mean, this is a gift for social historians. And it's the very, very essence of the human experience. It is the very essence of our life experience. To me, history is about the human experience. It is that experience. It is what we do every day. It's what we feel. It's what we say to our friends. It's the stuff that we can relate to, and also the stuff that feels so distant and so weird and so bizarre, and to try to understand why that feels so weird and bizarre, and what the other contexts of an era were. And so that's why these documents are so fantastic. I remember having a very similar experience when I wrote one of the books I wrote, Lady Worsley's Whim, which was about a very infamous criminal conversation trial in the 18th century.
That was, can I just say, Hallie, that was one of the books that got me into the 18th century. So thank
really,
you for that. Genuinely, thank you. Yeah, it really was.
Oh, I'm thrilled, because again, I found that enormous cache of documents about what Lady Worsley and George Bissett's elopement to London, and it was told in the round by the servants who witnessed it. Every step of the way, these were the servants at the hotel, this was the private investigator and what he saw, this was the hotel owner, this was this person's story, and it told the story in the round. But the conversation, I mean, the dialogue, that came out, the bits of dialogue that were genuine bits of 18th century dialogue that people spoke to one another, and how they felt about the situation and what they saw. it's arresting. I think it's as close as we can get to time travel, to be honest.
Oh, I love that. That's exactly how it feels. And sometimes you can get that in historic properties as well, where you kind of, I often talk about like putting my hand on the jamb of a door, that somebody has put their hand on that door 300 years earlier, and you're like, what?
Yes.
I'm literally traveling through time right now. The other thing that was really striking about this house, and then we'll kind of move beyond the house a little bit and move on with the story, but you're saying that that's the last time that Belle was seen alive, and we don't really know what happens that night after the Martinettis leave. But there's something so haunting about this idea that your friends leave, all seems well, and the next thing we know of Belle is that she is occupying a space in a cellar in the house. And I guess the secrecy, the privacy, and then the mundanity of everyday life behind that closed door, and the way in which that can conceal something so monstrous for quite some time, because at this point people don't know where Belle is, and that's where these women come in from the musical society, and we'll talk about them in just a moment. But there's something so haunting about that, and I think when we're saying that certain things appeal, i.e. this location, I think that that's potentially one of those reasons, because it's so affecting and it's so haunting to think that was in her home, as is still so often the case for so many women in violent situations. So what happens thereafter then, Hallie, is people start to, because Belle is missing, people start to question where she is. She's not the type of person to just go. And Crippen invents this story that she's very suddenly had to go to America to deal with a family matter. And I'm skipping forward ever so slightly here, but just to kind of get us to the women, really, in order to do this. He then says, actually, when she was there, she also died. She also happened to die. And then suddenly the Martinettis and others are going, hold on. This is not Belle. This is not how this would go. Tell us how important you think that group of women were to uncovering what had happened to Belle Elmore.
Absolutely fundamental. I mean, basically, Crippen would have got away with this had it not been for those pesky meddling women. I mean, it was, they raised the alarm. They were the ones who said, this story just does not fit. What you're saying is so completely out of character for our friend. And what you're doing is so weird that we don't believe what you're telling us. And we think there's more to the story. Of course, they would later say, we had no idea she'd been murdered. We just thought something strange had happened. I think they were starting to suspect there could have been foul play. But so it's okay. So it gets especially weird. So he lies. He says she's had to go to America. Somebody's ill in California, and she's gone all the way there. And you can't contact her. And these women knew. I mean, they were her very good friends. So Belle was active with the Musical Ladies Guild, which was a charitable organization which raised money for women and their children who were out of work as musical performers. And they gave them clothes, and they raised money for them so they could pay doctor's bills and legal bills and their rent and all sorts of things like that. And she was the treasurer of this organization, and they met every Wednesday. And this became the center of her life, and these friendships and these relationships. And she was very close with a handful of women, including Clara Martinetti, who was one of the vice presidents. And very interestingly, shortly, on the 2nd of February, Ethel appears instead of Belle. At the meeting of the Musical Ladies Guild, which is just, by the way, down the hall from where Crippen has offices, because Belle had arranged for offices in Albion House, which is where the the officers were. And Ethel turns up with a resignation letter, which she hands over. And the women were kind of like, what? This doesn't make any sense. I mean, imagine, your closest friend, somebody who's always in touch with you, just suddenly stops messaging you. Doesn't call, doesn't answer your calls, doesn't pick up their messages. And their partner or spouse just, oh yeah, they've had to go to, Tierra del Fuego or something like that, where, they can't get a signal, or, and you're just that, what? That's weird. And then what's even weirder is that there is a charity ball which is held, and Belle's been gone for about a month. And Crippen buys 2 tickets to this charity ball, organised by his wife's friends, with all his wife's friends present, and takes Ethel to the ball, filled with music hall performers. And Ethel is wearing Belle's diamonds, and she's wearing the rising sun brooch, which factors into this story, because it's quite a unique piece of jewellery that her friends all recognise. And she's wearing clothes that she had remade, that Belle owned, and later she's identified as wearing Belle's furs. And they're dancing and laughing and pretending that, nothing here is strange at all. And from that moment on, I mean, that was a deliberate insult. That was deliberate. We have to remember that, this is, again, a very bohemian circle, very tolerant of a lot of things. People had quite what would be called irregular relationships. They had affairs, they had children outside of marriage, and everybody knew about that. But this was something else. When you turn up with your typist to a ball and your wife is gone, I mean, that's a very clear sign that this person is your mistress. So, but that was pretty shocking. It wasn't that she was the mistress, it was that it was being done. It was flying in the face of all these friends.
What do you think's going on in Crippen's head in this moment? What is the thought process behind this? Because it's so brazen. It's so remarkable.
It's so brazen. I think it is. I think he is reacting in part to Ethel and Ethel's demands. This is Ethel's debut. Ethel has waited 6 years for this moment, because Crippen has been telling her, oh, Belle's going to leave me. She's going to leave me. She has a man in America. She's going to go and see Bruce Miller. She'll be with him. There was no proof that they were having a sexual relationship. And certainly by the time Bruce Miller had left in 1904, bear in mind it's 1910, they would correspond occasionally. And the interesting thing is, when the one piece of evidence that he tried to show that they were having an affair was produced in court, it was this letter which was signed "Love and Kisses to Brown Eyes." That was the steamiest thing he could find as proof of their affair, which is hardly some sort of impassioned declaration. And so Ethel's been waiting for Belle to leave for ages, and now she's gone. Ethel finally gets what she wants, which she gets the house, she gets the jewelry, she gets the identity of Mrs. Crippen. She's even mistakenly called Mrs. Crippen by the press, and on the seating chart and everything. She's loving that. I think this is all Ethel behind the scenes pushing this.
It feels like that. But if Ethel had been patient up until that point, or just patient enough, let's say, then the women of the Music Hall Guild are less patient, and rightly so, and they are pushing and pushing and pushing. And they eventually, even though Inspector Dew is initially a little reticent, he's like, well, I'm not seeing this, I don't know. Enough comes together eventually that he does decide to pay a visit to the house, where, am I right in thinking he encounters Ethel first of all? That's
yes,
yeah. So Ethel's there, and she's playing this. It's an odd scenario to find her there in the first place, and then Dew leaves, but he still then thinks he's gonna come back. This is after the disappearance, isn't it? And that's where the discovery is made. So maybe just talk us through that sequence of events, Hallie.
Yeah, well, I mean, it takes Dew a while. I mean, first of all, Scotland Yard ignores what all of the women have been saying. You know, a number of them go to Scotland Yard and they just don't want to know. To them, it's like, well, you know, what evidence do you have of anything? And so they start their own investigation. They hire a private investigator. And they're not really able to come up with anything. But ultimately, one of them gets... So Lillian Nash, her husband, is friends with somebody at Scotland Yard, quite high up. And they will listen to a man. So he comes in and says, look, you know, my wife and I believe that something strange has happened here. And they finally listen to him. And that's when Inspector Dew still is not, as you said, he's a bit on the fence about this. And takes his time to finally go and investigate 39 Hilldrop Crescent. Meets Ethel. And then takes Ethel to Albion House to... you know, so he can interview Crippen, and some really kind of bad policing happens at this point, which is it's like and Dew writes his memoirs and he just glosses over this. And again, this is okay, a pause for history nerding. One of the exciting things is when you get sources that you can corroborate or compare to one another. So we have Dew's actual memoirs that he wrote, and then his police report that he wrote up of what happened on that day, and then also you have Ethel's account of what happened, and so you can line all of these up, and you can see. And then you have Arthur Mitchell, who is his sergeant as well, telling the story. And you can line these up and you can see where the holes are. And you can see who's actually, you know, Ethel was a really difficult witness. I mean, she was a really difficult person to deal with. And she was trying to slow everything down. She's throwing spanners in the works. And you think, my God, this woman is really practiced at putting people off the scent. And it's not surprising, you know, her job was working in fraud. She was in business with a fraudster. They had people turning up all the time going, this medicine doesn't work, you know, come, you know, I'm going to report you to the police, and people asking questions and reporters coming by, and, you know, of course she knows how to deal with these people. So she treats Dew and Mitchell the same way. And so she tries to stop them from going into Albion House. She tries to delay them. And then, annoyingly, so Dew says to her, she says, oh, should I call him and tell him you're coming, you know, before they leave Hilldrop Crescent? He said, no, I want it to be a surprise. And so they turn up at Albion House. And she says, let me just go upstairs and tell him that you're here. And he says, well, I don't know. And then she runs upstairs. And he's just standing there. And Ethel is running up the stairs to go and tell Crippen, the police are here. That's what she's doing. So it's like, okay, activate plan A. So whatever that is, you know, all the lies that have been put in place of what we're going to say in case the police come looking. And it was so obviously all this was discussed and orchestrated. And he interviews them. He interviews Crippen for several hours, and then he interviews Ethel, and then they go to the house and they look things over. And then that is what basically makes Crippen and Ethel decide they better hightail it out of there. And they leave the next day.
Do you think, Hallie, that there's an element of denial with Crippen and Ethel, where they simply live in this world of their own creating of lies and deception, as you say? That's normality for them. That's their everyday job. That's how they make their bread. That is there a sense that they have this is just another lie, this is just something else they've had to think about, plan for, work as a team, and that it's, do they even know that they've done this crime? Like, are they deluded? Because the way that they behave, I mean, it is so brazen. They're so, I mean, obviously, you know, we're looking from the perspective of knowing what happened and knowing that they are guilty, but looking at it even from the perspective of an Edwardian, surely it's so obvious what's happened. Do they simply think they're going to get away with it because they are delusional? I don't understand what's happening in their minds.
I know. I feel like, okay, so I have, obviously ruminated over this for a very long time. I think that in terms of dealing with the gruesomeness of the murder, I think Crippen just disassociated. I think that was part of it. He knew exactly what he was doing. But Crippen's modus operandi as a fraudster was, and he was very good at what he did, was always do exactly the opposite of what people will expect you to do. So if people expect you to, lie, confess, and confess to something else, but don't, always, it's a three-dimensional chess game with him all the time, and you can see what's going on, and you can especially see, it becomes very, very clear when he's put on the stand. And he's trying to, oh God, it's a gorgeous cat and mouse game. He's trying to outmaneuver Robert Muir, who is the prosecutor. And Muir is so sharp. And he's got Crippen in corners. And this cross-examination goes on for about 3 hours. And he's wearing him down and wearing him down. And Crippen is lying, and he's tripping over his lies, and you can see his whole modus operandi and how he works. It's complete denial. It's just keep denying. I think he knew what he was doing. He was just, this is how he operated. And I think Ethel learned this too. I think I have often suspected, and again, with history, one has to be very careful. I'm not a psychologist. I wouldn't be. I'm not a criminologist. But my instinct is that Crippen was a sociopath and that Ethel was a psychopath. And Ethel showed absolutely no remorse for anything. She never, ever had an ounce of remorse for Belle Elmore or her family or her friends. She never expressed any of that until not even to the day she died.
I think there is so much in this history. I think so often people are so easy to say so much in this story, and it is a riveting story, but what it also is a history, and the facts that come with history are often so much more bizarre than fiction, and they're more just haunting seems to be the word that keeps coming back to me. And you said it first, Hallie, but I think it's so fitting in a case like this. But those facts are just so haunting, and you can see them spread out in such incredible narrative detail in Hallie's new book, Story of a Murder, which is available now. Hallie, before we let you go, I just would like to invite you to, if listeners could take away one thing from the book about Belle, what would you like them to remember of Belle? How would you like them to see Belle in their mind's eye when they come and open this book? And yes, there's some grisly details that come later, and that's very much the truth of her history. But how would you like them to take Belle's life away with them after they've closed the final page in your book?
I just think she was a kind of remarkable and resilient woman. And I hate using this terminology as a historian, and you will feel this too, is when I say, oh, she was such a modern woman, she feels very modern. She does. I mean, in this kind of way that, I think if Belle were alive today, she'd be sort of an Instagram influencer, because she, here's this woman who went into life feeling as if, she wanted to be a mother, she wanted to be a wife, she wanted to be a good Victorian wife, and she wanted to have all of the Victorian trappings. And that isn't what happened for her. That she had that taken away from her. And her story is, this is what women were supposed to be in the Victorian era. They were supposed to be mothers and wives, and that was it. She had that taken away from her. She could not be a wife. I mean, she could not be a mother. And instead, she chose a career. And at first it was opera, and she couldn't make it in opera, and then she chose music hall. And then she wasn't making the progress she wanted in music hall, so she worked as part of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, and then found her métier. She found the people she wanted to be with. She found a cause and a meaning in life. And she kept reinventing herself. And I just think, what an extraordinary woman to have faced that level of adversity and to still come out on top and to shape her life at a time when, you know, so many doors were closed to women and women faced so many hurdles. She is an extraordinary person, and I hope everybody who reads this book gets to know her.
Well, there you have it, listener. Go out and buy this amazing book right now. What are you doing? Drop what you're doing right now. Head out the door. Go on, take your wallet. Go and do it now. Hallie, it's just been absolutely fantastic to speak to you. Thank you so much. And listeners, if you want to hear more interviews like this on this podcast, you can get them wherever you get your podcasts. We always appreciate a 5-star review, so leave one of those wherever you can, and we will see you next time.